Hello, seventh graders. So today's lesson is sort of a mirror lesson of the medieval versus Renaissance philosophy that I gave you last week. So what we're going to look at today is the differences between medieval art and Renaissance art. And you've read about some of that, but I want to show you some pieces so that you can see the difference as to what was happening during the Renaissance time versus how it was actually quite different during medieval times and the reasons for that. I also want to say that it's really simple if you're looking at your two philosophy papers. If you put them together, you're going to see a lot of similarities between what was happening during the Middle Ages and what was happening during the Renaissance. I'm not going to ask you to take notes on this because I'm going to give them to you, but I do want you to see them, and then I want you to see them in the context of looking at art as well. So, the first thing, religious subjects, because the church was the only patron of the arts, everything that was done was sanctioned by the church. So they would say, hey, artists, could you draw some pictures? As opposed to Renaissance art, where there were patrons and they could be anybody. Maybe it was the church, maybe it was one of the Medicis, but the topics that we see are religious still, but we also see some other things as well. So you're going to see religious paintings as well as paintings about life. In medieval art, the figures were often long and stiff, and that means that they didn't really look very realistic. Okay, they were long. I'm going to show you some pictures. You're going to say, they don't quite look human. As opposed to when we switch over to the Renaissance and you see that figures are rounded and realistic. And this is that search for the natural order. So people were actually studying anatomy and making sure that they were getting it right. When you see figures in the Middle Ages, they're grouped in ways that don't look like ways that normal people would sit. So it doesn't look like sitting at a table, or it doesn't look like sitting on a chair, as opposed to the Renaissance where people are natural and realistic. In the Middle Ages, there are no light sources. Okay, people aren't concerned about that because the main thing here, remember, is religion. So it's telling the story that the patron, the church, wanted them to hear. When we get to the Renaissance, they're more concerned with how it looks. Does it look real? Can you see light coming through a window? Do you have a sense of what's actually going on and how people are feeling? In the Middle Ages, backgrounds are solid or patterned. Okay, they're not concerned. What did it look like behind them? Was there a mountain? Was there a hill? Was there a river? They don't care about that. They're only concerned with who is in the picture. And in this time, the most important people in the picture were the religious people. By the time the Renaissance comes around, backgrounds become very important. And you'll see in the Mona Lisa that was really sort of an interesting thing. A lot of talk about the Mona Lisa itself is a kind of background that she has and the sort of techniques that were used. When you look at architecture during the medieval time, it's tall and thin. You look at churches like Notre Dame, or you look at other places, they're very long, tall, and thin. In Renaissance times, the buildings had columns and arches because you'll recall that the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical art and architecture at the times of Greece and Rome. During this time, most churches are shaped like crosses, okay, so that people get the idea. And in Renaissance times, you'll see that they are circular or square. And I want you to think back about reading about Il Duomo, the cathedral that was done by Brunelleschi. Okay, in medieval times, the houses themselves were simply square houses. And what we see in Renaissance is the rich patrons, specifically the ones of the early Italian states, were hearkened back to the times of Greece and Rome, where everything was built around a courtyard. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is show you some of the pieces from these different time periods so that you can start to look at the differences and begin to notice them. And it's going to be important because tomorrow I'm going to give you a lesson or an activity where you have to decide whether the piece was done in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, and then tell me why, based on this information as well as your information from the notes, medieval versus Renaissance philosophies. Okay, so the first picture I want you to see is a very typical medieval picture. This is Mary and baby Jesus. You'll notice that a couple of things. First, notice the background. Okay, it's very plain. It's gold, and the reason it's gold is because these are very important religious figures. You'll notice too, for medieval people who were looking at these things, they wanted to make sure that they understood who they were. Okay, so look at this. If you look here, all around, you can see that Mary has a halo. That tells us that she's a very important religious figure. You'll notice that Jesus also has a halo. Okay, so we know that these two are very important people. One of the other very interesting things that you'll see in medieval art is this idea of even though Jesus is supposed to be a baby, he looks like a full-grown man. And there's actually a term for that. It's called homuncular. And the idea is that when the feeling was in medieval times that when Jesus was born, he was born into perfection. So he already was a man. So when you notice medieval art, you're going to see Jesus sort of looking like a baby man. Okay, a man baby, whatever you want to call it, because that's the idea that the people had during the time. You'll also notice that there's not a lot of depth in her face. Okay, look at her fingers. Notice how long and thin they are. Sort of an unnatural pose. It doesn't look like Jesus is actually being held by his mother. It looks very unnatural, so to speak. It doesn't look like a baby with his mother. It just sort of looks very stilted. Again, plain background, not particularly realistic looking. Okay, and this is a very typical scene for any medieval painting. Okay, if we go back, I wanted to go back one more. Here's another example, a really very homuncular looking man baby Jesus that we see here. Okay, notice the face of Mary. Her eyes look almost distant. She's not really looking at her baby. It's not a realistic look. Her face is extraordinarily flat. You'll see again the halo, okay, and this is very typical. You can also see her halo here if you look closely. And this is a really good example of medieval art. When we look at a Renaissance painting, okay, same topic, okay, same topic. Note the baby and the mother are looking at each other. This baby looks like a baby. Notice you can see like rounded cheeks. You can see the shadows under the cheekbones. You can see the baby looking at Mary and Mary looking at her baby. You get a light source, okay? So if you imagine this painting bigger, you can see that light is coming through a window. Notice how there's difference. This is the same fabric, but you can see different colors because there's light coming through and the artist has painted it. You can see through her veil again. Now there's sort of a muted background, But the other background you can see, so you can see it through her veil, a much more natural look. Okay, you can see the shadow under her lip. You can see shadow under her eyes. She looks like a real person. You can see the realism here. They still have, you'll notice there's also the halos here. Okay, so this was something that didn't necessarily go away. This is an earlier Renaissance painting, but you can clearly see the difference between the two. Okay, another a very common picture is the Crucifixion. Okay, when Jesus was put up on the cross, and you'll see here a very elongated man. Okay, you'll see his halo here. Okay, see his halo here. And you do see a background here, which is not as typical, but notice how very long and tall she is in compared to the proportion of her head. This is off. Okay, you'll notice that you'll see the halos here. Okay, you see the halos here. You see them here and here. These are important women in religious iconography. Notice that Jesus is, again, particularly long and thin and isn't proportionate to his head. Very different. There is some background, but you don't get a lot of perspective. Notice that this character, and this character all seem to be about the same size. If this character was in the foreground, she should look a little bit bigger. When we go to a Renaissance picture, this is the Pieta by Michelangelo, and this is after Jesus is brought down off of the cross, and this is Mary, his mother, holding him. And you'll notice that it's a particularly, you can see everything. You can see the strain in his ankles and look at his feet. You can see the veins in his feet. You can see the ribs in his body. You can see how incredibly lifelike his hands look. Okay, his body is slumped in his mother's lap. Notice Mary's lap. It looks exactly like a dress would look at that time. You can see her, look at her face. You can feel the pain that she feels as a mother. As much as she's a religious figure, in the Renaissance here, they're showing her pain during the time. And you can absolutely see the anguish, which is what the artist is trying to show us here. Another famous scene is the Nativity, or the birth of Jesus. And again, a very, very typical medieval painting. Okay, notice the homuncular Jesus. Okay, he looks like a man baby in this particular manger. You'll notice his halo. You can see the halo here of Joseph, the halo of Mary. Here are the angels up here looking, a very flat scene. Okay, gold is very typical. Notice his head. Notice this character in the painting's head. This is a very, very, very unnatural way to hold one's head. You'll look at her. Notice these long, thin fingers and long arms. She does not look like a real person. Okay, and again, that was not the purpose of this painting. The purpose of this painting was to make sure that the story was told, the story of the birth of Jesus. Okay. When we move on, here's another a Renaissance depiction of the nativity scene. And you'll notice, look at the background. Okay, we've got clouds. clouds here in the foreground look larger. You get an idea of depth here. There's a town in the background. People are coming to see the baby. Look at this baby Jesus. Okay, so this baby Jesus looks like he's actually reacting with the person that has come to see him. And these three gentlemen represent the three wise men that come from the east, and they bring for him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And you can see them trying to give their gifts. The angels are here on high. We get an idea of heaven above, and look at all the people. So here we have perspective where they're coming down this long hill, and the people in the foreground are larger than the people in the background, and that gives us an idea. Mary looks like she's watching all the people. She's holding her baby in a very natural way. And again, we see all the characteristics of a Renaissance painting here. Okay. And finally, we see a very typical religious scene as well, which is the Last Supper. The Last Supper before Jesus is crucified, and you'll notice that they're all sitting around. There's a very flat background. Again, notice the elongated hands. They're sitting very unnaturally. Some are looking at him, some are looking away. It doesn't look like anything in particular is happening. It looks like they just want to they want you to know what the scene is. These are all the disciples or the apostles, and they are religious figures, so they too have halos. Okay, you'll notice all of them. You'll notice here Judas does not, because he will be the one that betrays Jesus. Again, not particularly realistic looking art. Okay, another one. Now this is a mosaic, so it's perhaps a little bit harder, but again, unnatural poses. No one sits at a table looking like this, okay? However, we have them all here, and you can see them with Jesus next to him during the Last Supper. Okay, this is another picture of the Last Supper, and you'll notice that it's very typically Renaissance. So here's Jesus in the background, and we get sort of a stylized halo for him. All these guys have a different look, okay? They all have their own personality. This guy's pouring himself some wine. This guy's pouring this guy some wine. Somebody's drinking. They're having an interaction. This guy seems to be perhaps having a conversation with this one across here. These are natural things that happen at a table, okay? Notice their feet. The men in the foreground are larger than the ones in the background, and they're even larger than Jesus, which would never have been done in medieval painting. It didn't matter who you are, your size depended on your importance in a picture. Here, your place in the natural world, how it actually looks with personal perspective is what's important, okay? So you can see a very stark difference between this Last Supper and this Last Supper. Okay, so these are basically, these are some big ideas, I would say, as to the difference between medieval and Renaissance art. You can also see very similar ideas when you look at the notes that you took on philosophy. Now, I'm not going to ask you to take any notes on this today, but I will ask you to make sure that you have, when I give it to you, the what's the diff notes that I'm going to give you, as well as the difference in philosophy notes, so that when you do the activity later, you will be able to see and use those pieces of information as evidence for why you think a painting is particularly Renaissance or whether it's medieval. With that, it's been very nice to talk to you. I hope you have a really great day. Take care.